we are building a culture that does not work for us. We have lost connection to that idea that we are actually continuously being cared for by the whole world around us. How do we lift the veil? How do we release the idea that we are in fact being cared for all the time? The inquiry at the heart of it is, do we have what we need by ourselves, or do we have what we need in community?
Hi, this is Soumya, and you are listening to Loneliness Busters, a podcast where I talk to founders, researchers, policymakers, investors, community builders, and more on how to build a more connected world. I hope you join the squad. We need all hands on deck now more than ever. Hi everyone, I am excited to have Teju Ravilochan today with us. Teju is the founder for GatherFor, an organization on a mission to help neighbors become more connected and self-sufficient. They connect 5 to 7 neighbors into teams that support one another like family and empower them to build neighborhoods that they really want. Teju received Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2017 for his work as the co-founder and CEO of the Unreasonable Institute, a boot camp for social entrepreneurs tackling massive social and environmental issues. The company drew its name from George Bernard Shaw's quote, "All progress depends on the unreasonable man." So here today with us, Teju. Teju, welcome to the pod. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Soumya. Thank you so much for having me and hosting these conversations.
Great. Let's dive right in. You have a unique story and also you have a unique motivation to start GatherFor. Let's start from the beginning. Tell us where you come from and what motivates you, and why does this problem of social disconnection among neighbors matter to you?
Sure. I come from, I suppose where we all come from. I come from my ancestors who come from India. My parents immigrated to the US before I was born. And they come from a culture, as you know, probably Samya as well, where people often take really good care of each other. Both my parents grew up in multi-family homes. So you had aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, all living together in one house. And so you didn't need childcare. You had built-in babysitting. You always had someone to talk to. There were other complications, of course. It's not all rosy, but you have internal politics. You have, is there enough food? You have these kinds of challenges as well. But that was the context that they came from. And they came to the United States, where we have a very different narrative around meeting our own needs on our own. And the American dream is to work hard and create a life for yourself and to make it on your individual efforts. And their story, you could say, follows that narrative where they came here with only $200. That's all India would allow them to take out of the country at the time. But they had education. They were both trained as doctors. They weren't accepted as doctors when they arrived in the US. The foreign medical licenses they held didn't qualify them to work immediately as doctors. So they had to redo training here. And they had to find places where they could get a position. Fortunately, they were able to stay with my uncle in Cleveland when they landed, and that's where I was born. And then my father wound up meeting somebody named Stuart Schneck, who made a phone call for him and helped him land a position in Denver, Colorado, where my family eventually ended up. My sisters were born, and we grew up. And when we arrived in Denver, my parents were able to find a home and buy it for a $500 down payment because of a special affordable housing government program that was happening at this time. This is 1987, 1988. And then the furniture that my parents were able to get, a lot of it was donated from other people that my father met at the hospital. And now they have raised 3 kids. We've all made it. I had tennis lessons growing up. I got to do karate and all sorts of fun things. Some might say that they lived the American dream, and they did it on their own. But every step along the way, every critical juncture in their journey, there was someone there to help, whether it was my uncle to house them, Stuart Schneck to make a critical connection, the U.S. government's affordable housing program that made it possible to buy a home early in our family's journey here. And as I grew up, I also noticed this narrative that we have in our country about making it on our own, but it was quite contradictory to the culture that my family was raising me with, of we're a family, we take care of each other, we support each other. And so I was always interested in reconciling these different narratives. And that's some of what's drawn me to the work of GatherFor today, where the inquiry at the heart of it is, can we take care of each other? Do we have what we need by ourselves, or do we have what we need in community? And that's really what's brought me to this work. And I can say more about my own struggles with loneliness, with friendship, with caring for others and wanting to be cared for, that have also brought me to this work. But that's some of the journey that's brought me here.
That resonates, right? Especially as an immigrant myself, so many times we see the story that we want to see, right? And we think that it is all us and it's my hard work and my. But when I landed in the US, I stayed with my uncle the first 2 weeks and went to Boston, and it was my first month there. For the first time, I realized I'm so far away from everyone I know. And so I called my mom and I was like, Mom, I'm really missing you. I'm missing family. And she called a cousin who called a cousin who delivered homemade food in Boston. And I was like, this is crazy, but probably that's why I survived, right? So it's such a beautiful story. Tell me a little bit about your personal motivation as well. I feel like you're one of those rare breeds who's actually dedicated his life to others since the beginning of your career. You've seen lots and lots of problems that exist around us and lots of people who've been trying to solve those problems. So why did you pick this one? Why did this one resonate with you? Why do you think this is what the world needs right now?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the deepest challenges that I've faced in my life is loneliness. I've wanted to have good friends, to have good community, and I've wanted to sustain relationships over many years where we check on each other and take care of each other. But I've perpetually found that's very hard because people move, people get jobs, people meet partners, people have children. There are all these dynamics in our lives where, and you can't blame anyone for it really. It's really hard to just spend a day taking care of your kids, going to work, feeding yourself, getting enough rest, let alone then also having an in depth quality conversation with a good friend who might live on the other side of the country in a different time zone. That's possibly too much for most people. And we live in a context where structurally there's not a lot of space for that. And in the meantime, I'm observing right now, I'm here with my parents in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and my sister, and my brother in law, and my two nephews. And I can see, even though we have sort of an intergenerational multifamily setup here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that it is very difficult, especially for my sister, to hold a job, have two children, and even though she has the grandparents around, even though she has the uncle around to help take care of the kids, to help with some of the cooking, she is still tired and exhausted most days and doesn't get enough rest. And that might just be the story of motherhood or parenthood, especially when kids are young to some extent. But it is really different than some of what I have maybe seen in India with my own eyes and read about, especially among indigenous communities. I was reading an article in NPR that was just out last week about how in the Central African Republic they've been looking at a hunter-gatherer tribe there. There was a there was a scientist, Nikhil Chowdhury, who was documenting all the child rearing that was happening in the community. Every 20 seconds he would make note of who was interacting with the child, what were they doing, and what he concluded was that every child in the community has between 8 to 15 people who are involved in their parenting, whether that's watching them or
Wow.
feeding them or cleaning them, playing with them, whatever it might be. Can you imagine what it would be like if all of our children had 8 to 15 parents, or allo parents as the term is, involved in their childcare? How much of a burden would that lift for us? For people who have carrying the mental strain of taking care of their children just on their own. I heard Ezra Klein in a podcast recently saying that he and his wife, who went through a very serious illness, have had two kids, and they feel like they barely survived raising two kids on their own. Even though they're highly educated, famous, wealthy people, they are struggling just with meeting their needs on their own. And my personal motivation in all this was, how do I find belonging who am I? Am I part of this American culture that we are all building together? Am I an Indian? Do I come from an Indian cultural background? Is that determining who I am? And how should I live? How should I relate to my people, to the people that I love, who I long to connect with? And I think that as I study this issue personally and through other stories and through research, we are building a culture that does not work for us. It's not going to help us meet our needs. And that's the really pragmatic consideration under it all. Can we meet our needs in this way? And I think that when we do, if we are successful according to our cultural metrics, if we make a good enough living, that living essentially gets us the help of other people to take care of ourselves. Then we can pay for childcare. Then we can pay for people, maybe even to help cook food for us or to grow food for us. More and more of the functions that we need to take care of ourselves become externalized to somebody else who we can pay to do it. And we now have a system where the farmer grows our food, the doctor mends our broken bones, the carpenter builds and fixes our houses. All these people, the teacher looks after our children and educates them. And it's extraordinary. And all these roles are sacred and beautiful. And I'm really grateful that we have them. But what's between us and those people is this layer of money. We are paying those people, whether through our taxes or directly, to care for us. And sometimes it makes us forget that just for us to have a plate of food, just for us to have a room to call our own, just for us to have a glass of water or a walk on a trail or to have a car to drive or any of these things in our lives, someone did that. Maybe not for us, but yes, for us. And we are benefiting from the care of hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of people in order to just take a step, breathe, eat, survive. And so we have lost connection to that idea that we are actually continuously being cared for by the whole world around us. So my personal interest is, how do we lift the veil? How do we release the idea that we are taking care of ourselves and that we are in fact being cared for all the time? And how do we deepen that practice so that it's not only those of us who are wealthy who can be cared for, but all of us who can get our needs met? Because we all deserve that. And most of us cannot afford the support of other people financially. Most of us cannot afford to pay the $22,000 a year on average that it costs to pay for childcare support. And that's just one aspect of life, let alone food or housing or water or healthcare or some of these other things. And so my question is, can we live differently? And that difference is not necessarily a new way of life. It might be an old way of life that our ancestors have practiced, that indigenous communities have practiced, that communities of color have practiced, that make up America. And we have lost that, I think, both spiritually and culturally in this way of life here in the US. So that's been my curiosity. What would it take to make a cultural transition? And is that something that we feel the value of doing as we start to experience it?
There's so much to unpack there, but I love the layers. The most evident one is the tactical one. I was just telling you before we started recording, I had a rough week. My baby was down with RSV. My husband lost his voice, and I'm very lucky. Generally, I have one set of grandparents in the house, but this month and next month we are all on our own, and then of course I have a podcast and I'm starting up, and so it was just, oh my god, I was like, oh, when is this getting over? When are they going to get better? And so the tactical part of it, of course, is what people live every day, and how you live every day is how you live your life. And if you're perpetually stressed, and automatically when you're doing all of this on your own, you feel like, is there anyone around? Am I the only one like dealing with this? Seems like on Instagram everybody is having fun, right? So there's the tactical part of it, and then of course the next level is the cultural part of it, or mindset, or how we think we should be living our lives, and what really matters, and what is success, and what do we value. But you also went a level deeper, which is, I would almost say, spiritual, right? Even if we do a cultural change, even if we start rewiring people on what matters and what doesn't, there is also an aspect of gratitude and being connected and being grateful for people and things around you. And you're right, capitalism has a lot of benefits. It is efficient, but at the same time, it does make stuff transactional. I have given you something, so I deserve in return your best service. This idea of I deserve is very counter to almost all the wisdom there is in the world. And there is a lot to unpack, but let's start one by one at each level. Let's start with the tactical stuff. It is a big problem. It is also a very complex problem. You started GatherFor with you have to start somewhere very specific, and you start with one person, two-person, five people, a neighborhood, etc. And so you started with physical neighborhoods. You started with people who live near each other, and your radical idea is you should know your neighbors, right? So tell me, why did you start with physical communities and neighborhoods? Does it matter still in the world of technology and social media that we know our neighbors?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the pragmatic question is always, what are our needs and how do we meet our needs? And I think that all of us have basic needs like food, shelter, water, safety, belonging, community, all of these different pieces. And what are the best ways to meet those needs? Food is something physical. You can't do it via social media. I mean, I guess you could order things from Instacart or something like that, but at some level, food has to be physically with you. And for many of us who don't have the financial privilege of being able to order groceries or something like that, we need food whether we go and buy it. And for a lot of people who are struggling, especially in the pandemic and also more broadly, that there's a need for food and it has to be close to us and we have to be able to get it every 3 times a day. There's a need for safety right where we live, and that safety is not going to come from social media. I mean, there are ways that can be hand stored that digital technologies can support in that, cameras and supervision and everything else, but safety often comes from community. It often comes from being accompanied by other people. If you're walking down the street, you're walking by yourself versus you're walking with 4 friends. Those are very different experiences of safety, for example. And a lot of us, when we're sick, for example, we might need a bowl of soup. We might need medication that comes from a nearby pharmacy. So there are things that we can do when we're proximal to each other that are essential. Imagine at the core level, imagine raising your children remotely. Imagine building a relationship remotely. Most people don't like long distance relationship. Why? Because there's something about sharing space, sharing experience that becomes possible when we're proximal to each other. And most of our strongest communities, our strongest relationships often have to do with who are we physically proximal to, at least for a period of our lives. And while I think it's very possible to build great friendships on Zoom or to do a lot digitally, I think that meeting our needs at the most practical level involves our physical environment. And that's where neighbors can help one another. They can bring you that cup of soup or that medication. They can watch your children. They can pick up a package that's left in front of your doorstep. They can bring you a meal if you're sick, or if you're giving birth and you can't do that for yourself. There are many things that neighbors can do that are really hard to do remotely. So that was part of the consideration. How do we do this as neighbors, especially because a lot of us have lost that connection and a lot of us have lost that support that comes from people around us being there for us.
Tell us what GatherFor does. Who do you serve? What is the mission? And
Yeah,
how do you break open such a thriving community in neighborhoods?
sure. GatherFor is grounded in the belief that in community we have everything we need. So we organize neighbors, physical neighbors, into teams of 5 to 7, as you mentioned, to support each other like a family. And that might look like watching each other's kids. It might look like cooking for one another. It might look like running an errand. It might look like sharing stories and sharing dreams. It might look like, oh, you lost your job. You're not able to afford food. I know the food pantries in the area. Come with me to this church, or I know, come with me to this food giveaway that I know about. And it might look like pooling funds as a group to help one another pay bills. So it takes all those forms in these groups of 5 to 7. And then we provide each team with $300 a month to have an activity together. Could be a potluck, could be a trip to the museum, could be spa day, could be just a meal together. And then we match funds that team pools together to help one another pay bills up to $500. So if everyone puts in a group of five $100, that's $500. We match it so it becomes $1,000, and the group will select one person that month to receive that $1,000, which they can put to their rent. They can use to start a business. They can use to buy school supplies for their kids, whatever it is that they're needing that month. And the recipient rotates every month. So we do that. And then we link all of these different teams of 5 to 7 to the other teams in the neighborhood of 5 to 7. And we have monthly town halls where we talk about the neighborhood, what we want to see in the community, what we can do to make it better, and what these people in these neighbor teams want to do to make it better. And then we might resource and support the community in doing that work. And for example, recently we did a kindness party where we fed homeless people. We organized all these resources. We had about 400 attendees. It was sort of a block party. And we also helped, the members of this community also helped, and I can tell this story in more detail, the local building get repairs done at their property by the city government in New York. And so these are the kinds of things that we do. It's bringing teams of neighbors together. They support each other. We resource those teams. We link the teams together so they can create the neighborhood that they want. And we're primarily working with low-income folks right now living in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And so almost all of our participants are black or brown, and most of them are women. A lot of them are immigrants and survivors of domestic violence, incidentally, but most of them have experienced food, job, or housing insecurity very recently or are currently experiencing those issues.
That's that sounds like a community I want to live in. And very honestly, in the last 1 year, I think this has been my mission to get to know people around me. But it's still very difficult to put yourself out there. And so, if there is a structure that makes it easy, it's a brilliant idea. So, tell us in more detail, how do you go about it? I'm a neighbor, or I live in this community where you're starting this. How would I discover you? Why would I join? What happens when I join? Of course, I'm half skeptical and I don't know what I should expect. How do you actually go about onboarding folks, and what is it that they expect, and how do you start the journey of Gather for a Neighborhood?
Absolutely. So most of the time, if you're coming in together for, you've heard about it from somebody who's already part of it, whether that's a friend, a sibling, a neighbor. People talk about it in the laundromat. People talk about it in the hallway, the grocery store, on a bus. People meet strangers and share the information about GatherFor, but they hear about it and they are intrigued by what they hear. Just like you said, they also feel like they want to live in such a community, and to know that this is happening in their neighborhood is exciting and it's compelling. And so they will reach out, or they'll go to our website, and there's a short form that they fill out that just asks for their name, sort of what's their interest in joining or taking part, if they understand these certain details about how the program works, and then their contact information. So then I'll reach out to them, and we'll just have a conversation, and I'll hear more about their story and what's present for them right
You
now. What are they
personally reach
looking
out to
for?
everyone?
Yeah. And then they will also have questions. I'll tell them about how the program works. I'll see if they understand it. And the top line is, nobody's going to take care of Brownsville like the people of Brownsville. Nobody's going to take care
Mm-hmm.
of this community like the people who live here, and which people really love. They really hear that and they think, yes, that's true. And they have a history in Brownsville and among many black and brown communities of feeling neglected by politicians, of feeling that private companies take advantage of the local community spaces and assets, that nonprofits will come in and out and you'll get funded to do some work there, but they won't stick around that long. There's all these different issues, but ultimately the people who live there are the people who are invested in making it better. And so we talk about that. We really start from the why of all of this, and then we try to paint a picture of what it could look like. And I'm also honest about the fact that we're learning, we're growing. This is an experiment. There's challenges. People have conflicts sometimes. People don't show up sometimes. Maybe there's some things that we try that aren't fun or enjoyable, or they feel like an obligation when you'd rather be doing something else. All that's going to happen and be part of this experience. And we are always interested in feedback and improving it. But we share this, and then we ask if people are interested in giving it a try. And so in giving it a try, they we'll ask them who are the kinds of people that they would like to be on a neighbor team with. Are there specific individuals that they would name who they'd like to do this with? Maybe it's their friend, their sibling, someone they know in their building. If and sometimes they have such people, sometimes they don't. They say, no, I just moved here, or I was just put here. I just came out of a homeless shelter, so I don't really know anybody here. So you say, okay, what are the kinds of people that you might be interested in connecting with? They might say, oh, I'm a mother. I would like to be with other mothers. I'm an immigrant. I'd like to be with other immigrants. I really care about education. So I want to be with others who really value education. It could be anything. So, based on what information they give us, we try to match them to people who look like what they are interested in joining. And some people are open to being on a team with anybody. And then we have a few sessions that I will help facilitate just to welcome people. And in these sessions, we'll say, look, this is the purpose of this team. The 4, 5, 7 of you are gathered here to essentially learn to connect with each other and support each other. And we have a workbook, and the workbook takes people through a journey of telling stories to each other and then building a culture from those stories. So the first session is about telling stories of someone who's really been there for you and telling stories of people you've really been there for and people who are really special to you, which everyone loves to talk about. Everyone loves, so we're not starting with tell us your struggles, tell us your pain, tell us your, we don't trust each other maybe at the level to talk about that yet. So here we're talking about things that bring us joy, but also once we tell those stories of people who have been there for us and people we've been there for, then we as a group make meaning of those stories. So then the workbook asks, okay, so now that we've heard everyone's stories about what when we feel really supported and when we really support other people, how do we want to build a culture of support on a group of people who are just getting to know each other? What would it look like? What would it feel like? And then people articulate that together and they come up with a shared vision of maybe we would get together regularly. Maybe we would listen to each other. This is what listening means to me. Maybe we would show each other different resources that we know about or places that we could go. Maybe we just would get our kids together. They define and they describe that. And then they slowly, progressively take on more vulnerable questions, also in the form of stories. They will keep talking about, later they'll talk about their hopes and aspirations. Where are they now in their lives in terms of their physical well-being, in terms of their intellectual and emotional and spiritual being? Where do they want to be? And they'll articulate as a group, what are their common aspirations and how do they support each other in getting there? They'll later talk about conflict, tell stories of times that they're proud of how they handled conflict. And from all those stories, they will create a conflict resolution framework that they can use themselves when they inevitably run into conflict as a group. And so the workbook guides them through this storytelling based process of revealing that they have wisdom within them from their own life experience, that if they put that together, their life experiences together, that's a culture. And that culture can support them in connecting with each other and supporting one another and being there for one another and building this kind of community that we're talking about. So it's all premised on the idea that we have what we need in our own life experience. We have what we need in our communities. It's not that we need outsiders to come and teach us. That can be helpful at times. But the truth is that we have here what we need. If we can just see it, if we can just remember it, that's what we're trying to bring forth in these early conversations within the group. And the group starts to self-facilitate, so I'm not involved anymore after the first session. And they run using the workbook, and they have a joint, we have a platform, they have a sort of a joint bank account where they receive their $300 and they vote on how to allocate it, and only if everyone agrees is it allocated for that purpose. And where they pool their funds and that money is redistributed to one person each month. Again, they all have to agree. So those are the structures that are in place for the neighbor and typically what kinds of things that they experience going through it. And neighbors have been so passionate about this experience. They have said it changed my life. I feel like I found a family, a second family. Sometimes I feel like I talk to my teammates, my neighbor team every day. They're the first people I go to after God or after everything goes wrong. They're the first people I go to. Sometimes just to share. When I was sick in the hospital, they're the people who came to visit me. When I got arrested, they're the people who wrote letters on my behalf. They've talked each other through suicide and depression. They have picked up each other's kids from school. They've become beloved aunties and uncles to those kids. That they've just found really deep ways of supporting each other through all of life's vicissitudes, and a lot of them have been going now for 3 years. So they've maintained a deep bond and connection as a community, as a small team, as a family.
What has been the biggest surprise for you as you went through this journey with the neighbors?
Everything has been a surprise, to be honest, because this is a bit contradictory to, I think, a lot of what we learn about how to grow up, how to be an adult, how to be self-sufficient. And one of the first surprises was when we first tried this model, we actually didn't have groups of peers supporting each other. We had volunteers who would help people who had lost jobs or were facing food insecurity to find new jobs, to get a resume, to find food, to get health care. And that model was great, and the recipients of the support were grateful, but there was this sort of awkward dynamic in that they felt conscientious about how much support they were receiving. It's because the support was only flowing in one direction, flowing from the volunteers to the recipient. And in our culture, it is shameful, I think, to receive help, because if we need help, it means that we can't do it on our own. And that's the thing we're supposed to do. We're supposed to feed ourselves and our kids, put a roof over their heads all by ourselves. The first surprise was that we have to have reciprocal relationships. Reciprocity is an antidote to that shame. So if we are able to give people help and that receive their help, we're much more comfortable with those kinds of relationships. So reciprocity has become a really big part of this approach. And that's when we really shifted to it's got to be people who are going through similar things, helping each other, as opposed to outsiders or people who have the privilege to not have to worry about getting their needs met. And I think that's also another surprise, that there's something about needing each other that really builds community and connection. When we don't need each other, if I don't really need you, sometimes it can be hard to go very deep in connection. And so there's a level of that I think has been really meaningful. I think that another surprise has been how this kind of community, I think, can happen between any group of people. And that's part of what we're trying to figure out. We think a lot
So the
about
matching
friends.
algo doesn't really is not required, is what you're saying? Because a lot of the reason I asked that is, at least in the social tech world, there's so much emphasis on, hey, we are going to find the exact right people for you, and we are going to match all
Yeah.
the attributes. And um, is that what you mean? I just wanted to understand the
Yeah,
meaning behind the sentence. Yeah.
I think that it can happen with potentially any group of people. I mean, I don't know if sometimes groups aren't going to click well and people aren't going to click. Of course, it's going to happen. But by and large, what we're learning is that a lot of the people that we're working with don't have a lot of specifications about who they want to try this with. They're willing to
Mm.
try it with anyone so long as people can agree to ways of being together and honor those ways of being. No one's going to hurt each other. No one's going to be rude to each other. People are going to do their best to really to be considerate. Um, if
Can I
that's if
pause there for a second? Because I think the sort of dichotomy that we are grappling with right now, which is, do I need to be people like me to feel belonging, versus can I actually feel belonging with any human as long as we have the right covenants, decorum, whatever you want to call them. In so many ways, that is a microcosm for what's happening in the US, what's happening globally at some level, right? Where we think that we need to check a few boxes to be able to trust people. And
absolutely,
listening to you over the last 10 minutes or so, eventually I think what you've cracked is trust building, right? Can I trust you even if you don't believe in the same God as I do, you don't have the same lifestyle as I do,
mm,
you eventually you have two legs, you have red blood running in your veins, and eventually you want the best for yourself, your family, and others, right? What you just said is so counter to the generally, I think what we think about when we think about social infrastructure, social technologies, especially in the for profit world, that I had to pause. As so much of this comes down to what we think is important versus what we experience. And yeah, it's very powerful and very interesting that you think matching is. 2 weeks back, I had a conversation with CEO of a fairly effective social intervention technology, and he said the magic is in the matching. Now, the context is different because they deal with people who are going through a certain ailment or trauma or
Mm,
disease. And
mm,
so for them having the ability to talk to someone who's been in their shoes, it is a
mm.
shortcut to be able to feel like you're not alone in this. So I think the context does matter, but there are so many different ways to build that trust, and some one of those many ways is shared experience, but it could also be shared values, shared physical space, shared meal. It
Mm.
could be shared identity. You and I look the same, and so it feels, oh, maybe we are friends in a shorter period of time than other folks. So I think there's so many ways to get to the trust problem. But tell me, this is also the trust problem is also one of the most difficult problem, right? Because the challenges are difficult as well. So
Yeah.
tell me what doesn't work well, or what have there be conflicts or challenges that you've learned from. What have been the failures in the journey so far, and what have you learned from them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the failures have a lot to do with when people don't show up and when people ghost, which is not uncommon, in fact. And we've had people vanish and never heard from them again. And we used to have loans that we would give out to neighbors as they were going through financial difficulties. And a lot of them absconded with the money and never were in touch again. So we've tried a lot of different things, and we were willing to do some of those experiments, especially to learn our way through this. And I think what we have learned is that at the heart of a lot of this is shame. The heart of a lot of this is the experience of I'm not good enough. I'm not able to do what's asked of me, and that thing that's asked of me is so basic. Show up to a meeting, or say hi to this person, or talk to them, or ask how they're doing, and I just can't do it right now. And there's a lot of shame in having to face that for yourself and having to admit that to somebody else. Or I can't pay back this loan, so I can't face that. I can't reckon with that. And so how do we create a culture or container where we are removing shame? And we can't fully, it's not in our control because people have their own experiences and they're going to feel shame about things that we might feel surprised that they feel shame about. But that's part of the culture that we're trying to build through storytelling. And so storytelling is very powerful for a variety of reasons. One reason is that when we really tell our stories, it is hard. What happened when I told my story? The first thing that you said was, I relate to that. It resonates. I have a similar story because I came here as an immigrant and here's what I experienced when I was an immigrant. And most of the time, when we do tell our stories, people will see common ground in our stories. So if we start from our positions, I'm a mother, I'm a Democrat, I'm a rich person, I'm a poor person, our identities in those ways, those are things that make people say, I'm not that. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a mother. I'm not a rich person. But if we sometimes don't know any of those things, but we instead say, this is a story of a time that I was there for this person and it really felt good to me. Or this is a story of a time when someone was there for me. Someone would be like, I had that exact same thing happen. My friend showed up for me and they did this thing and they brought me chicken soup when I was sick and it really made a difference for me. That's why I think storytelling is such an extraordinary part. That's why maybe matchmaking has less pressure for us because so much of the experience of this journey is first the common ground of living in the same place, which actually means potentially we're of the same race, at least in Brownsville. We have a similar experience, maybe class wise, maybe job wise, because this is a poor community that we're working in. So there are some commonalities already determined by and the people who naturally have signed up for this. Maybe there's a self-selection and that sort of thing. We're not forcing anybody to do this. This is something you're opting into because you want to be part of that culture. So there's also probably a self-selection in that. But with even given those things, if people are sharing real stories about their their hopes, their dreams, their relationships, their experiences with being listened to or being rejected or any of these kinds of things. We do storytelling about race. What was the first time that you came across the idea of race? What was that like for you? Whether you're white, black, brown, yellow, it doesn't matter. I mean, that is a moment where everyone has never heard of race before, and all of a sudden it's a thing in their life. Maybe you were six, maybe you were four, maybe you were 17, but that moment, there can be a common ground that's found there. And there's something about storytelling that widens the field of common ground that we can find, I think. And that's why it's so essential for both building connection and relationship and taking the pressure off of matchmaking and reducing shame and stigma. Because if we are telling stories, have you ever been in a position where you couldn't do that which was expected of you? Have you ever taken a loan and not been able to pay it back? Have you ever promised something to a friend and not been able to deliver on that promise, even though it seemed like it was pretty easy? What happened? How did you handle that? That kind of storytelling means that we all know what that's like. Of course I've done that. Of course I've let down my friends. Of course I have not been there when I said I was going to be there, and it felt terrible. And then what happened afterward? Was I destroyed? Did the friendship die? Like, telling those stories can really illuminate for people both what to do and also that they're not alone. And so I think it's not to say that it's all working and then we figured it all out, but we're trying to get better and better at creating conditions for which our neighbors can tell those stories to each other. And that's what we're slowly trying to imagine is if you can pick your neighbors, right? They might be strangers to you, but what if you were able to tell these kinds of stories to your neighbors and you were able to hear those kinds of stories from them? How much easier would it be to then think about watching each other's kids, which is a very difficult thing to trust someone else to do. Do they share your values? What kind of snacks are they going to give your kids? Are they loaded with sugar? Are they vegetarian? Are they gluten free? Do they have a gun in their house or not? And how do you feel about that? Do they smoke? What do they do when they want to take the kids outside? What happens if the kid gets hurt? What are they going to do? How do they discipline the kid when the kid does something wrong? These are all things that are very hard to align around before trusting someone to take care of your child. But what if you could tell these stories and you could talk about these kinds of things with your neighbor in the context of raising your children together? Now, it's not necessarily about political positions and identities, but it's about how do we do what is best for our kids. And some people are going to decide you're not the right neighbor for me to watch my kids, and that's totally fine. But at least having those conversations and having the chance to tell those stories, it increases the chances that trust blossoms and that we can move toward that.
Let's talk about moderation, community moderation. And I think you talked about creating the right environment for the stories to flourish. More and more, the idea of holding space, being able to do active listening, is we don't get practice of these skills these days as much. And as you were talking about this, the question that comes to me is how do you make sure that there is the right culture of giving space and not jumping to conclusions and not overtly judging, not going into solutioning, because there are cultures that can increase shame. If somebody shares a story and you say, oh, why didn't you try this? Or this is so easy and I've done. So how do you handle this, the skill building or the culture building aspect of it if you're not in the room or an expert is not in the room or someone who's done this is not in the room and it's all newbies in the room trying to go through a workbook?
Absolutely. And so we're trying to build neighbor teams that don't require a moderator or a facilitator that's outside of the neighbor team. So how do we do that? For example, about listening, we ask the neighbors, one of the whole meetings in the workbook that's laid out is about listening. And so we ask each neighbor to tell a story about a time when they felt deeply listened to. Could be a recent time, could be long ago, but just a time when they felt really heard and seen in what they had to share. And then they tell a story of a time that they deeply listened to one another. And then we have the team, just like we've talked about here, make sense of it and say, okay, what are the conditions that we see in common across times when we felt deeply listened to? And what are the conditions we see in common around times when we felt we were able to really listen? And how do we want to show up for each other as we listen to one another? What does it look like? What do we think about advice giving? What do we think about problem solving? What do we think about interruption? What do we think about this and that? They come up with their own cultural understanding of what good listening is, and they come up with agreements around it. And then they have those agreements to always come back to, and then they talk about what should we do when, and the workbook prompts them to do this. What should we do when we don't honor these agreements? What should we do when, as humans, we make mistakes and we inevitably don't listen the way that we are describing here? What should we do? And they will describe their own way of dealing with that. Maybe they just say it. Some teams are just like, hey, I don't feel like we're listening to each other right now. Maybe we could all take a deep breath. And some of the other teams, they'll say, I remember that this person really likes this from their story. This person really likes to be listened to in this way. I'm not sure that's happening right now. Can we check in and see if that person feels listened to? So they create a distributed mechanism of calling one another in to the agreements they've set. And one of the great things about storytelling is stories are memorable. So if I tell you a story about a time that I really felt heard and listened to, the likelihood that you remember it is higher than if I just say, Soumya, I like it when you don't interrupt me, for example. And it's not only about the nots but that don't do this, but it's also about the things that really I did appreciate. And we rarely have that chance. When have you been asked, Soumya, how do you like to be listened to? Or tell me about a time when
I
you
don't think
were
ever.
listened to
I
really
need to have
well.
a conversation with my husband. Teju, after this one. We should have this conversation.
I was just going
Yeah,
to say,
no.
if you could
Go ahead.
try this on your own. This isn't magic, but you could take any relationship in your life and you could try to tell these stories to each other and see what is the result in your ability to listen to each other. You don't have a moderator, you don't have a facilitator, but what happens when you tell these stories and you can bring them back into any moment? And that's what we're trying to help our teams to do, but it's also something that's so available to all of us.
Yeah, no, isn't it? I feel like if we can make it more accessible to figure out, like, how do we have those initial conversations? Because it's the how. It's like, I don't know how to structure it. I don't know what questions to ask. But if you ask the right questions, becomes magical. So it is magic. What you're doing is magic. Tell us the future plans for Gather for. What's the big vision, and how are
Yeah.
you thinking about the next few years?
Yeah, so we're very small right now. We're just working in one neighborhood with a few dozen participants, and we've been trying to learn the cultural dynamics here. So we're very much at the beginning stages, trying to figure this out. We don't have all the answers, but we want to grow, we want to expand, we want to be the size of the neighborhood, and then maybe we can be in other neighborhoods too. In Brownsville, Brooklyn, there are lots of public housing developments, and we've been curious, can we expand into those public housing developments, which have lots of people living right next to each other? It'd be perfect if people were in these kinds of teams and supporting each other. It'd be really easy to watch each other's kids or cook for each other. So we went to this public housing development, and I met with a lot of the residents there, and they really didn't have the capacity to hear what I was talking about. And the reason is that they were very concerned with the state of disrepair of their building. People were getting hurt, people were falling down, ceilings were collapsing, there was mold, there was leaks that kids were breathing in, there's asbestos, there's all kinds of issues that have been going on in this building that have been neglected for years, and they have not received sufficient attention and response from the New York City Housing Authority, who is the landlord and the manager of the building, who's in charge of making these repairs. And I asked them if they'd ever come together and tried to get this addressed collectively as a unit, and they just said no, they didn't have that trust, they didn't have that sense of connection with each other. And also the New York City Housing Authority is used to getting a lot of complaints. They're used to being the bad guy or people thinking they're the bad guy. And as I spoke to people at the New York City Housing Authority, I think they are tired and frustrated of always being seen as letting people down when they're doing their best with their limited budgets to oversee hundreds of thousands of apartments across the city of New York. They're the largest housing authority in the entire North American continent. And so what we wound up doing is 8 women in this building. I worked together with 8 women in this building because we're trying to start GatherFor there, and we got 8 women to sort of say, "Hey, we see what you're trying to do. This would be interesting for us to try." These 8 women went door to door and they collected the repair needs of every apartment in the building. And we
Wow.
compiled all of that into one spreadsheet and we sent it to the New York City Housing Authority and we said, we are going to throw a block party in 3 months for the whole community. We're going to have free food. We're going to have music and dancing and activities for kids and all sorts of partners are going to show up. And here's the Brooklyn Public Library, and they're going to give away. They're going to sign up people for library cards, and the Brooklyn Book Bodega is going to give away 500 books, and this group is going to Tribeca Pediatrics is going to do free checkups for kids. We're going to do all this stuff at this party, and we're going to invite all of our representatives, and maybe the press will come, etc. We would like for you to complete all the repairs at the building by the time of this party in 3 months so we can celebrate and acknowledge you as well at this party in front of everybody. And the New York City Housing Authority said yes. And they made 1,600 repairs in 60 days. They just flew. They just made so many fixes. People who had been waiting 5 years for broken pipes that had been flooding their apartment to get fixed suddenly had them fixed. Mold was removed. Asbestos was dealt with. Collapsed ceilings were repaired and fixed. All these things were addressed by the city housing authority. Um, and so it worked, and it was amazing. And the community in the building really coagulated. Like people who previously didn't trust each other were hugging, were checking in on each other, were so happy. And so we learned in this process that sometimes in order to expand into new parts of the neighborhood, we have to meet people where they are and help them address their needs. But at the same time, it was a group of 8 women who got this started in their own community, and we gave them some stipends, a little bit of money, a little bit of infrastructure, a little bit of training that came from a mentor. And so, what else could happen? So, we want to do a couple of things. Number one, we want to create not just neighbor teams, but action teams. So, this group of 8 women, they're a perfect model for an action team. A small group of people who wanted to make a difference in their neighborhood, who we equipped with a little bit of money, a few connections. They made this big transformation happen for their building, for which houses over 1,000 people. And so we're going to create we've gotten some funding to try out action teams. So we have action team ideas around immigration, around housing, around children's activities. People want to start softball leagues for kids and around safety, all sorts of things. So we're going to form these teams in the neighborhood for people to address challenges that they see, and they're going to get small grants of around $8,000 to make things happen in their community, which is exciting. We're also going to be trying to expand via public housing across this neighborhood and grow in that way. And I think we're also a big dream is to expand beyond working with low income people to people of all incomes, because we think everyone needs this kind of community and support as long as people are willing to engage in reciprocal relationship, both giving and receiving support. And in that, we have a very peculiar and strange idea inspired by indigenous practices and by some other great practices we've seen, some cool company called Commingle, for example, where we'd like to create a community powered basic income. So you've heard of guaranteed income or basic income, maybe, where people get like $500, $1,000 a month. Maybe it comes from a foundation or the government. But if you have cross class participation, and you could ask everyone to chip in to a community pot, something like 5% of their income, which is not insignificant. I mean, we'd really have to work hard to get this to happen. But if you had people earning $30,000 a month, let's say they're doctors or they're execs at Google or something like that, and you had people earning $2,000 a month and $1,000 a month, let's say these are the 3 income levels in the community, or the 3 people in the community, and everyone gives 5% of their income, that adds up to those 3 people would put in a pot a total of around $1,500. And then if you take that $1,500 and you divide it up and you give it back to everyone in equal amounts, then everyone gets about $500 back. So the person who gave $30,000, they put in around, I think, $900. That's 5% of $30,000. Or they put in $1,200, I think. And so they're losing some money, but we can give them a tax deduction for that, and they're supporting their neighbors. The others who are earning $1,000 or $2,000 a month, they're putting in $50 and $100 a month. That's 5% of their incomes, but they're getting back $500, which is a 50% boost for the first person, 25% boost for the second person. The point is that you can create a community powered basic income that lifts up everyone in the community. And so these are the ideas that we want to try by approaching homeowners associations, business associations, professionals within the neighborhood, is part of this idea that in community we have everything that we need. And so we want to try these action teams. We want to expand through public housing. We want to create a community powered basic income. These are all our ideas. We are in conversations and trying to figure out the way forward. We don't have it all figured out, but those are some of the things that we would like to try in the coming months.
Wow, I think we can talk for hours. I'm so grateful that people like you exist and you're doing such impactful work on a problem that I think is one of the greatest problems of our generation and in our society right now. One fun question: what is your favorite social connection ritual?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of my favorite social connection rituals is to start with silence. So it's to sometimes invite people to take 1, 2, 3 minutes of silence when we start a conversation, and then just to ask what's present for you. And that could be anything. It could come from the silence or from something else, but it's been really powerful. And I think it's powerful because in silence, whatever is really there for us kind of comes up. Maybe we're frustrated or angry or tired. And then I just feel like whether we're talking about it or not, what's present for us is showing up. And so we might as well talk about what's real if people consent to that, if people want to do that. That's been one of my favorite practices. So silence followed by just asking what's present for you in this moment.
But I've learned so much from this conversation. I will pick a few of my learnings and implement it in the next week or so and see the magic unfold. Thank you so much for sharing your story and also sharing such inspiring work that you've been doing. Thanks for coming to the pod.
Thank you, Soumya. Thank you for hosting these conversations and for taking on this subject of loneliness. I agree, it's one of our deepest needs to address as a human race. So I'm excited that you're illuminating stories of how we might go about it. So thank you for what you're doing.
If you're still here, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend who you think should join the Loneliness Busters squad. See you next time.